A city without walls could be more secure than any fortress. This video uncovers 28 ingenious, non-walled defenses that kept medieval settlements safe for centuries. You will learn how strategy and intelligence consistently defeated raw military power. How did a swamp become a more effective barrier than a stone rampart? What hidden force could make an entire army vanish before reaching its target? The greatest historical protections were often invisible, woven from the landscape and the human mind. What does true security really look like to you? High on a windswept peak, a village slept peacefully for centuries, while empires clashed in the valleys below. Its greatest defense was not stone, but silence and distance. This is the power of geographic isolation, a passive shield that turned the land itself into an unconquerable fortress. Settlements established in locations of extreme remoteness presented a simple, brutal calculation to any would-be conqueror. An impassable mountain range, a vast desert, or a trackless swamp created a moat of hardship and distance that was often more effective than any man-made wall. The legendary city of Petra thrived in its hidden canyon, its narrow, defensible entrance shielded by the sheer rock of the Jordanian desert. Similarly, the monastic communities on the Mount Athos Peninsula in Greece were protected as much by the Aegean Sea surrounding them as by their faith. An army marching toward such a place faced a campaign of attrition before it even saw its target. Supplies dwindled, morale sank in the face of relentless terrain, and the element of surprise was lost. How many invasions were quietly abandoned when commanders realized the true cost of the journey? This reliance on the land's natural armor leads us to another elemental protector, one that could both nurture a city and drown its enemies. An army sinks into the mud, its heavy armor becoming a death sentence as defenders move like ghosts through the reeds. Marshlands were not mere obstacles, they were active participants in a city's defense, a living, breathing shield of treacherous ground and hidden peril. Early Slavic settlements known as gords were often strategically placed within these watery labyrinths. For any invader, the approach was a nightmare. Cavalry, the shock troops of medieval armies, were rendered completely useless, their horses stumbling and drowning in the mire. Siege towers and catapults could never be dragged through the unstable ground, leaving an army stripped of its most powerful tools. But the true horror for an attacking force was the unseen enemy. Local defenders with generations of knowledge navigated hidden causeways and floating log roads to launch devastating ambushes from the fog, only to vanish back into the impassable terrain. Beyond the immediate danger of ambush and drowning, the swamp itself fought back. The stagnant air carried the stench of decay and the ever-present threat of malaria, an invisible guardian that could decimate a besieging camp without a single arrow being fired. This environment did not just defend a city, it consumed its enemies, proving that the most formidable fortress might have no stone walls at all, only the ground beneath its feet. From the deceptive stillness of the swamp, we find another form of liquid defense, one that could be directed and controlled with cunning precision. A river could be a city's lifeblood or its most devastating weapon. By mastering the flow of water, medieval engineers transformed peaceful landscapes into dynamic traps. They built networks of canals and sluice gates not just for irrigation, but for deliberate, strategic flooding. When an enemy army was spotted, these systems could be activated, turning familiar farmland into a shallow, impassable sea. The approaching force would find its path blocked, its supplies stranded, and its siege equipment mired in mud. Entire regiments could be isolated on newly formed islands, cut off from reinforcements and easy prey for defenders in boats. The most dramatic application was the deliberate breaching of dikes. A city would sacrifice its own outer fields and pastures, allowing the sea or a swollen river to reclaim the land. This was a profound act of communal resolve, a calculated decision to lose a season's harvest in order to save the entire community. The Dutch became the undisputed masters of this watery defense, their very existence dependent on holding back the sea, a power they could unleash upon invaders with terrifying efficiency. This was not a wild, uncontrollable force of nature. It was a disciplined, intelligent application of hydrological knowledge, a clear example of human ingenuity turning the environment into a shield. This same principle of shaping the land for protection extends from the flooded plains to the dense, shadowy depths of the forest. A dense forest could swallow an army whole. While stone walls stand static against an assault, a living wall of ancient trees presents a shifting, intelligent adversary. Thick woodlands were not just passive barriers, they were dynamic defense systems that actively worked against an invader. For a large military force, a forest was a logistical nightmare. Columns of armored knights could not maintain formation among the tight-packed trunks, their famous charges rendered impossible. Supply wagons and heavy siege engines became permanently stuck, forcing an army to abandon its greatest advantages. In this tangled maze, the local defenders held all the cards. They knew the hidden animal trails and secret clearings, moving with a speed and silence that was utterly alien to the invaders. The Swiss Confederates perfected this form of warfare, using their intimate knowledge of the alpine forests to launch devastating ambushes against the heavily armored knights of Austria. From behind ancient oaks and rocky outcrops, their attacks were swift and merciless, after which they would melt back into the shadows, leaving the confused and demoralized enemy to hack futilely at an invisible foe. But the forest itself could be weaponized. Paths were deliberately left open, only to lead into areas riddled with camouflaged pitfalls lined with sharpened stakes, or towards carefully prepared deadfalls designed to crush anyone passing below. Beyond its role as a tactical weapon, the forest was a source of enduring strength for the community. It provided a continuous supply of game, berries, and fresh water for the defenders, while offering nothing but starvation to a besieging force camped at its edge. The trees were a renewable resource, providing timber for palisades and fuel for warmth through long winters. This organic barrier demonstrates a profound strategic truth that sometimes the most powerful defense was not to construct a fortress, but to preserve a natural one that already existed. This principle of integrated protection extended even further, woven directly into the very homes where people lived. A city's greatest strength could be its deliberate confusion. Walking through the old quarters of Siena or the Medina of Fez is like stepping into a living puzzle, where every narrow, winding alley and sudden dead end was a calculated feature of a brilliant defense strategy. This was not haphazard growth, it was urban planning as a form of warfare. The wide, straight boulevards of later eras were designed for parade and control, but the medieval mind built for survival. An invading army, accustomed to open battlefields, would find itself funneled into a tortuous maze. Their formations would shatter as the streets twisted and turned, separating knights from their supporting infantry. A soldier rounding a corner would find himself not in a town square, but in a cramped cul-de-sac, a perfect kill zone where defenders could rain down projectiles from the surrounding rooftops and shuttered windows. Meanwhile, the city's own inhabitants moved with an unseen advantage. They knew the secret passages connecting one house to the next, the arches that led from a bakery to a stable, allowing them to appear, strike, and vanish without ever using a main street. This labyrinthine design transformed every citizen into a sentinel and every building into a small, interconnected fortress. The city did not just house defenders, it actively fought alongside them, using its very layout to disorient, divide, and defeat a more powerful enemy. This clever manipulation of space above ground invites a question: what about the hidden world of defense that lay just beneath their feet? Deep beneath the quiet streets, an entire world lay in wait. While invaders searched the empty surface, the real city was alive and breathing far below their feet. Across medieval Anatolia, in the region of Cappadocia, people did not just build upwards, they excavated downwards, carving vast, multi-level subterranean cities like Derinkuyu directly into the soft volcanic rock. These were not simple caves, they were meticulously engineered labyrinths, some descending over 10 stories deep. They housed thousands of people, complete with living quarters, stables for livestock, churches, and extensive storage for food and water. Ingenious ventilation shafts, sometimes stretching for miles, brought fresh air to the deepest chambers, while massive, circular stone doors, weighing half a ton, could be rolled shut to seal corridors against any intruder who discovered an entrance. The entire population could vanish in a matter of hours, leaving an attacking army with nothing to conquer but a ghost town. An invader could torch the surface buildings, but the real city and its people remained completely immune to fire, siege engines, and direct assault, safely hidden in a sanctuary of stone. Yet these tunnels served a purpose beyond mere hiding. They were also a platform for a terrifyingly unpredictable form of warfare. From the safety of the deep, defenders could launch offensive operations, digging secret saps to undermine enemy fortifications, or emerging from hidden exits behind besieging lines to wreak havoc on unprepared camps. The psychological impact was profound, creating a constant, unseen threat that turned the very ground an army stood on into a place of paranoia and danger. This brilliant strategy of making a city disappear, of using concealment as a primary shield, makes you wonder what other defenses were hidden in plain sight, not below the ground, but upon it. A community could be thriving just beyond the tree line, and you would never know it was there. The art of environmental camouflage took the principle of concealment to its most elegant extreme, hiding entire settlements not underground but in plain sight. Builders used only materials harvested directly from the surrounding landscape. In a forest, structures were made of timber and sod, their roofs growing moss and grass until they were indistinguishable from the rolling earth. In rocky deserts and canyons, like those inhabited by the ancestral Pueblones, dwellings were constructed within the cliffs themselves, their mud brick walls colored exactly like the surrounding stone. From even a short distance, these multi-story cities simply vanished, appearing as nothing more than natural shadows and rock formations. This was not just a matter of paint, it was a profound philosophy of integration, making the human world a seamless part of the natural one. A band of raiders scanning a valley for plunder could ride right past their target. Their scouts might rest in the shade of a cliff, completely unaware that 100 families were living in the hollow rock above them. Without a visible target to focus on, an army's momentum was broken before it even began. There was nothing to besiege, no gates to storm, no centralized prize to capture. The ultimate defense became anonymity, a strategy that asked, how can you attack what you cannot find? This brilliant visual deception represents one side of a coin, the passive act of remaining unseen. Its more active and cunning counterpart is the deliberate creation of illusion. A grand, imposing gateway stood alone in an empty field, promising a fortress that did not exist. This was the art of the bluff, a defense woven not from stone or soldiers, but from pure perception. For a small or vulnerable community, the ultimate protection was to convince a potential enemy that an attack would be far too costly to even attempt. They engaged in psychological warfare, crafting an illusion of overwhelming strength. One of the most effective methods was architectural deception. A settlement might invest all its resources into building a single, magnificent gatehouse, its towers reaching for the sky, its portals reinforced with iron. From a distance, any scout would report a formidable citadel, leading their commanders to assume mighty walls and a large garrison lay just out of view. The reputation of the defenders was another powerful shield. A town could cultivate a fearsome identity, perhaps spreading tales through merchants and travelers of its citizens' ferocity in battle or their unwavering resolve. The Mongols mastered this form of intimidation, their very name becoming a weapon that could shatter the will of armies before a single arrow was loosed. Spies were often employed to circulate carefully crafted rumors of divine favor, mythical guardians, or hidden legions waiting in reserve. Some communities staged elaborate ruses. The same company of 50 soldiers could be made to look like 500, simply by marching in a loop around a forested hill, changing their banners and appearing to be a fresh regiment each time they came into view. The goal was always the same: to win the conflict in the enemy's mind, to make the risk so great and the reward so uncertain that an invasion was never ordered. This high-stakes game of deception required not just cunning, but a deep understanding of human psychology and fear. That same strategic intelligence was equally vital in a more subtle, yet equally devastating form of conflict, one fought not with illusions but with gold and grain. Gold and trade routes could forge a shield more powerful than any army. When a city became the indispensable hub of commerce, any attack against it was an attack against the prosperity of every trading partner, creating a web of mutual defense woven from pure self-interest. A rival lord might possess the soldiers to storm the gates, but he would hesitate if that city was his only source of high-quality iron for his knight's armor, or if its powerful merchant allies could respond not with soldiers, but by freezing his assets and cutting off his supply of salt, silver, and luxury goods. The Hanseatic League, a vast confederation of northern European merchant guilds, perfected this model. When a member city was threatened, the League's response was not always to raise an army, but to impose a crushing trade embargo. They could close their powerful trading posts, known as contours, to the aggressor's merchants, effectively locking them out of the most lucrative markets from London to Novgorod. An entire kingdom could find its economy grinding to a halt, its warehouses overflowing with unsellable goods, and its treasury bleeding gold. This was a cold, calculated form of warfare fought with ledgers and shipping manifests, one where the besieging army might find itself starved of pay and supplies by its own bankrupt ruler long before it could breach a single wall. Commerce was transformed from a simple exchange of goods into a geopolitical weapon, proving that financial ruin could be a more effective deterrent than a moat. This intricate network of shared economic interest created a powerful incentive for collective action, a principle that extended directly from the counting house to the mustering field, where the call to arms was answered not by a single lord, but by an entire community bound by a solemn oath. Sometimes the ultimate defense was to offer the enemy nothing but ashes. A community facing an unstoppable invasion could choose a path of devastating sacrifice, burning their own fields, demolishing their own bridges, and poisoning their own wells. This was the scorched earth policy, a strategy of total denial that turned abundance into desolation. Its goal was simple: to starve the invading force into retreat by systematically eliminating every possible resource they could use to sustain their campaign. As the enemy advanced, they would not find villages ripe for plunder, but smoldering ruins and salted earth. their foragers would return empty-handed, their horses would find no fodder, and their soldiers would grow weak from hunger and thirst long before they ever reached a decisive battle. The most famous historical example is Russia's grim response to Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812. Rather than confront his vast force directly, the Russians withdrew ever deeper into their own territory, methodically destroying everything in their wake. The French emperor marched into Moscow expecting a triumphant victory, only to find a deserted city that was soon set ablaze. Trapped in a frozen, foodless landscape with winter closing in, Napoleon's retreat from Russia became one of the most catastrophic military disasters in history, a defeat delivered not by a great general but by a barren land. This approach demanded almost unimaginable fortitude from the civilian population, who had to willingly abandon their homes and destroy the fruits of their own labor to secure a future freedom. It was a brutal calculus, trading short-term suffering for long-term survival, proving that a people's resolve could be the most unforgiving terrain an army ever had to cross. This willingness to sacrifice everything for the collective good finds a powerful echo in another form of defense, one built not on destruction but on a shared and solemn promise. A lone flame flickering on a distant hilltop could save an entire city. The most brilliant defense strategy was useless without one critical ingredient: time. To buy that time, medieval societies developed intricate early warning systems that functioned as the nervous system of a region. These were not simple bonfires, they were carefully coded communication networks, often using chains of beacon fires strategically placed on high points, hills, and specially constructed towers. The message they carried was one of imminent danger, a signal that could race across the countryside faster than any horse or army. The famous beacon chains in England, designed to warn of the Spanish Armada's approach, demonstrated the sheer speed of this system. A message could travel hundreds of miles in just a few hours, a feat unimaginable for a mounted messenger. This gave defenders the most precious of all advantages: foreknowledge. Farmers could drive their livestock inside a protective ring of stakes. Militia members could grab their weapons and muster at prearranged positions, and non-combatants could be moved to safety. The entire region transformed from a collection of isolated settlements into a single, connected defensive unit. The safety of a bustling market town now depended on the sharp eyes of a solitary watchman in a coastal tower. This reliance on shared vigilance fostered a powerful sense of communal responsibility. Beyond the dramatic fire signals, other methods filled out this intelligence network. Swift messenger riders on fresh horses carried more detailed information along protected roads, while systems of flags or polished shields reflecting the sun could send coded messages between nearby forts. This web of communication turned information into a tangible asset, a shield woven from light and speed. It meant an invading army, no matter how powerful, would never find a sleeping or unprepared target. They would instead march into a territory that was already awake, organized, and waiting for them. A holy site could command more respect than 1,000 spears. In an age of brutal conquest, the status of a religious sanctuary offered a unique and powerful form of immunity, a shield woven from faith and fear. Monasteries, cathedrals, and pilgrimage routes often stood for centuries without a single defensive wall, protected not by soldiers, but by their perceived spiritual significance. Even the most ambitious warlord would often think twice before violating such a place. To plunder a holy site was to risk more than just a battle. It was to invite the wrath of the divine and incite the fury of the entire faithful population he hoped to rule. This was a calculated risk few leaders were willing to take. In medieval Europe, this idea was formally enshrined in movements like the Peace of God, which declared clergy, pilgrims, and their lands as inviolable. An attacker who disregarded this protection might find his short-term victory undermined by a long-term rebellion, as the very people he had conquered rose up against the sacrilege. This defense leveraged deep-seated superstition and genuine belief, creating a protective aura that could prove far more durable than any stone fortification. It forced conquerors to weigh immediate plunder against lasting stability, a calculation that often saved countless lives and preserved centers of culture and learning. This intangible shield, built on the foundations of societal belief, makes us consider the other profound ways a community's own internal structures could form an impenetrable defense. A city's safety could be guaranteed by a single piece of parchment. This was the power of diplomatic immunity and political status, a defense built not on stone, but on the intricate web of treaties, alliances, and promises that governed the medieval world. Certain cities became untouchable not because of their walls, but because of their role as neutral ground for international negotiations or as hosts to permanent diplomats. Attacking such a place was a political catastrophe waiting to happen. It could instantly transform a local conflict into a wider war, uniting multiple rival powers against the one foolish enough to break the sacred rules of diplomacy. Within the complex patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire, free imperial cities enjoyed precisely this kind of protection. Their privileges and autonomy were granted directly by the emperor himself, making an assault on one an act of rebellion against the highest secular authority. A city like Regensburg, where the imperial diet often met, was shielded by the collective interest of all the princes and bishops who needed a secure place to debate and deal. Its safety was everyone's business. To violate that was to risk the wrath of the entire empire. This system created a powerful incentive for neutrality. A city that served as a meeting ground for warring factions had a vested interest in maintaining its impartiality, and any aggressor who broke that trust would find future negotiations impossible and former allies turning into enemies. This defense was fragile, relying entirely on the calculated self-interest of powerful neighbors, but when it held, it provided a security that no army could breach. The intricate safety found in political complexity finds its ultimate expression in a far more personal and direct form of protection, one that armed every single citizen. An invading army might shatter the city guard only to find the battle has just begun. When every baker, blacksmith, and farmer is also a trained soldier, conquest becomes an endless, bloody nightmare. This was the power of the citizen militia, a defense that transformed the entire population into a living, breathing shield. Unlike a professional garrison that could be defeated in a single, decisive battle, a universally armed populace created a defense in depth that was impossible to fully extinguish. The Swiss cantons perfected this model. Their famed pikemen were not career warriors but farmers and herdsmen who spent their peacetime days in the fields, yet they trained relentlessly in coordinated formations on holidays and market days. When foreign armies marched into their valleys, they were not met by a solitary force, but by the collective might of the entire community, organized and terrifyingly effective. This system fundamentally changed the mathematics of invasion. An enemy could not simply seize a central fortress and declare victory. For every professional soldier they defeated, 10 more militiamen would emerge from the very landscape, launching ambushes from forest trails and defending their own village squares with a ferocity no mercenary could ever muster. The line between civilian and combatant was completely erased, turning every farmhouse into a potential fortress and every passerby into a hidden threat. This deep-rooted martial culture made the cost of invasion so prohibitively high that many potential conquerors simply looked elsewhere for easier plunder. The collective strength of an armed populace, however, raises a compelling question. What happens when a city's defense extends far beyond its own borders, woven into a web of mutual obligation with powerful friends? A wedding vow could forge a shield that guarded an entire city for generations. Strategic marriages among royal and noble families transformed personal unions into powerful geopolitical defenses, creating alliances so formidable they made invasion unthinkable. A town under the rule of a count whose son was married to an emperor's niece was not just an independent settlement, it was an extension of the imperial family's honor. To attack it was to deliver a direct insult to a much larger, more powerful realm, guaranteeing a devastating war. These were not love matches, they were meticulously negotiated treaties where the dowry was not merely gold but peace itself. The history of medieval Europe is woven through with these alliances. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon to Isabella of Castile did not just unite two powerful Spanish kingdoms, it created a combined force strong enough to complete the Reconquista and fund the voyages that discovered a new world. A single wedding could prevent a conflict that might have cost thousands of lives, turning a potential battlefield into a peaceful border for decades. This system created an intricate web of mutual obligation that spanned continents, where a duke in Burgundy could call upon his cousin the King of France for aid, or a dispute over a small fiefdom could draw the Holy Roman Empire and the Papal States into a wider war. Family politics became a matter of national security, and a bride walking down the aisle carried the safety of her entire homeland with her. This intricate, long-term web of familial obligation presents a fascinating contrast to its more immediate transactional counterpart, the business of hiring professional soldiers. A city's treasury could summon an army from thin air. For wealthy trading hubs that lacked the population for a large native militia, the solution was not to raise soldiers from their own people, but to rent the most formidable fighters on the open market. This was the age of the Mercenary Company, where military power became a service for hire, and the mere knowledge that a city had contracted such a force created a powerful, invisible shield. Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, rich from trade but politically fractured, were masters of this strategy. They did not wait for an enemy to gather at their gates. Instead, they would engage a renowned condottieri captain and his band of professional warriors well in advance, publicly signaling their readiness. The deterrent effect was immense. A neighboring lord, considering an invasion, would have to weigh his ambitions against the cold reality of facing a hardened, well-equipped company whose entire livelihood depended on its success in battle. The reputation of these mercenary bands was a weapon in itself. A city that hired the White Company, known for its disciplined English longbowmen, or a German band famed for its brutal close-quarters combat, was sending a clear message. The cost of victory would be catastrophically high. This system transformed economic prosperity directly into military security, allowing commerce to fund a defense that was both mobile and intimidating. It was a stark lesson in the value of quality over quantity, where a few hundred seasoned professionals could deter an army of thousands. This reliance on specialized, elite forces for protection finds a fascinating parallel in a much more ancient and enduring form of defense, one that relied not on hired swords, but on the moral authority of a single, timeless book. A reputation could be a more potent shield than any fortress wall. The most effective defense was sometimes a story, a carefully cultivated legend of ferocity that made an enemy's will to fight crumble before the first arrow was ever loosed. Communities like the Swiss Confederates did not merely win battles, they weaponized their victories. Tales of their unbreakable pike squares, standing like a forest of steel against charging knights, spread through the taverns and courts of Europe. Would you, as a commander, willingly march your prized cavalry into a formation known to grind men and horses into pulp? The Welsh longbowmen created a similar aura of dread. Stories of their yard-long arrows, capable of piercing plate armor at 200 paces, turned the prospect of an assault into a calculation of certain slaughter. This psychological defense was not an accident, it was a cultural project. Songs were composed celebrating heroic last stands. Skalds recited epic poems of Norse berserkers who felt no pain and knew no fear, and returning merchants would spread exaggerated accounts of an enemy's brutality. It was a form of strategic brand management where the product being sold was total annihilation for any challenger. This intangible asset, built on a foundation of genuine capability and masterful storytelling, cost a city nothing in gold or stone to maintain. Yet it paid for its security 1,000 times over by simply making the price of invasion seem too terrible to pay. This deliberate crafting of an intimidating identity relied entirely on a foundation of real, demonstrable skill, a mastery that had to be practiced from childhood. A Gaelic warrior clad in a simple plaid could vanish into the morning mist and reappear a mile away to strike at the flanks of a heavily armored English column. This was the power of specialized terrain warfare training, a defense that transformed the local population into an extension of the landscape itself. When a community's entire martial culture is forged by the challenges of its homeland, every citizen becomes a master of a unique form of combat that outsiders cannot easily replicate. Islanders did not just know how to sail, they practiced amphibious landings on treacherous shores, timing their attacks with the tides. Mountain dwellers honed their skills in ambush on sheer cliffs, using gravity as their ally by rolling boulders down upon invaders. Desert tribes perfected the art of the feigned retreat, luring overconfident enemies deep into the waterless sands where heat and thirst did the killing for them. This intimate knowledge created a brutal asymmetry on the battlefield. The Gaelic clans of the Scottish Highlands, for instance, turned their rugged glens into a death trap for English armies. They knew the hidden passes, the bogs that could swallow a man, and the exact moments a sudden squall would blind their opponents. An English knight, weighed down by his plate armor, was a sitting target for a Highlander who could move with breathtaking speed over ground he had known since childhood. This defense ensured that even if an enemy miraculously navigated the natural barriers of mountains or swamps, they would not find a vulnerable population waiting for them. Instead, they would step into a vast, open-air training ground where every farmer and herder was a highly specialized soldier, and the very land beneath their feet was a weapon pointed back at them. This deep, generational mastery of the environment for combat naturally raises the question of how that same intimate knowledge was used for a more fundamental purpose, ensuring that a community could eat even when completely surrounded. An army could watch a city's main granaries burn and still lose the siege. The ultimate defense against starvation was not a mountain of grain in a central square, but 1,000 tiny, invisible caches scattered where no enemy would think to look. Communities facing the threat of a long siege mastered the art of logistical deception, creating hidden, decentralized networks of food and water that were virtually impossible to completely locate or destroy. Public granaries were often just a decoy, a tempting target for an invader's fire arrows or for spies to report on. The real sustenance was secreted away in places of ingenious concealment. Families buried sealed pots of grain beneath their own hearthstones. Water was channeled into camouflaged cisterns deep within natural cave systems. There are even accounts of food stores being placed in weighted, waterproof barrels and sunk to the bottom of wells or secluded ponds to be retrieved under the cover of darkness. The people of Malta during the Great Siege of 1565 exemplified this grim discipline. As the Ottoman forces bombarded their positions, the defenders and civilians survived for months not on the food in their storerooms, but on secret reserves of hard biscuit, olive oil, and water hidden in cellars and underground chambers. This strategy demanded absolute communal trust and secrecy. A single whispered conversation overheard by the wrong person could unravel the entire system. For the besieging army, this was a special kind of torment. They would count the days, watching and waiting for the signs of desperation and hunger that signaled an imminent surrender. Yet, as the seasons turned, the defenders on the walls remained alert and strong. Morale in the attacking camp would plummet as their own supplies dwindled, while the city they had trapped seemed to draw sustenance from the very earth. This invisible war of attrition targeted the enemy's greatest vulnerability: the immense logistical strain of keeping a large army in the field. The ability to outlast an opponent by cleverly managing your own resources points toward a far more aggressive tactic, one that actively seeks to starve the invader before they even arrive. A poisoned well was a weapon that kept on killing long after the defenders had withdrawn. This defense moved beyond merely denying resources to an invader. It transformed the land itself into a trap. When faced with the certainty of conquest, a community might choose a path of ultimate sacrifice, rendering their own water, fields, and workshops not just unusable, but lethally hostile to any occupying force. The most direct method was the deliberate contamination of water sources. Animal carcasses, from sheep to cattle, would be cast into vital wells and springs, fouling the water with disease and decay. In more permanent acts of defiance, precious stores of salt were poured onto fertile fields, ensuring nothing would grow there for years. The destruction of key infrastructure was just as critical. Mine shafts were collapsed, forges dismantled, and their anvils thrown into deep lakes, and specialized tools smashed beyond repair. The goal was to leave an invader with nothing of value, not even the means to sustain their own army. A force that marched in expecting to find fresh water and a functioning workshop would instead find only cholera and rust. They could not establish a garrison, they could not live off the land, and they certainly could not profit from their supposed victory. This was a defense of last resort, a grim declaration that freedom was worth more than the land itself. It sent an unequivocal message to any conqueror. You cannot rule here, for we have made this place a tomb for your ambitions. This willingness to embrace utter desolation to preserve their liberty reveals a profound truth about the medieval mindset, where the law itself could be forged into a shield as resilient as any wall. A royal seal pressed into wax could command more obedience than 1,000 knights. The authority of a legal charter or imperial decree created a shield of legitimacy that was often more resilient than any physical barrier. When a king or emperor granted a city a formal charter, he was not merely bestowing privileges, he was weaving that city into the fabric of his own authority. To attack such a place was to challenge the monarch's word itself, an act that could transform a local conflict into a rebellion demanding a royal response. London's liberties, formally recognized in documents like the Magna Carta, were a powerful example. The city's rights were enshrined in a text that the crown was bound, at least in theory, to uphold. A rival baron considering an assault on London would have to weigh his ambitions against the near certainty of facing the king's own army, summoned to defend the royal prerogative as much as the city walls. Similarly, free imperial cities within the Holy Roman Empire answered directly to the emperor, not to any local duke or count. Their legal status made them political islands, and an attack on one was a direct challenge to imperial power, guaranteed to unite a fractious collection of princes against a common enemy. This defense was built on the medieval world's deep, though often contested, respect for law and precedent. A written promise stored in a cathedral treasury or city hall held a power that could deter armies. It forced aggressors to navigate a labyrinth of legal obligations and potential consequences, where a victory on the battlefield could mean a defeat in the courts and the councils of power. This intricate shield of written law, however, could not protect against every threat. It ultimately relied on the faith that men would keep their sworn oaths, a faith that sometimes found its only true refuge in a higher authority. A saint's bones could hold back an army more effectively than a legion of soldiers. For the medieval mind, the physical remains of a holy figure or a relic intimately connected to them were not mere objects of veneration. They were conduits of divine power and protection. A city that housed such a treasure, like Cologne with its relics of the Three Kings, believed it enjoyed the direct favor of heaven. This conviction forged a psychological shield that was as real as any rampart. An enemy commander, often a devout believer himself, would have to grapple with a terrifying spiritual calculation. Was launching an assault worth risking the eternal wrath of a powerful saint? Would God grant victory to those who desecrated a holy site? This fear could paralyze an invasion before it even began. Yet this same faith created a double-edged sword for the defenders. If they believed their patron saint had abandoned them, perhaps due to some collective sin, their morale could shatter, leading to a swift surrender. Conversely, if they felt their sacred guardian was being attacked, their resistance could transform into a holy war, a fanatical struggle where every citizen fought with the fury of the divinely wronged. The strategic value of a major relic extended far beyond the city walls. A famous pilgrimage site drew a constant stream of devout visitors, making the city a node in a vast network of faith. To violate such a place was to insult every pilgrim who had ever journeyed there, potentially uniting distant kingdoms in a crusade of retribution. The defense was no longer local, it was international, powered by the collective outrage of the faithful. This spiritual deterrence, woven from belief and reputation, created a unique form of security where the most powerful defenses were those that existed in the minds of both the protected and the potential conqueror. This profound reliance on divine favor for protection finds a stark contrast in a defense that was utterly grounded in the physical world, one that fought an invisible war against a foe no sword could touch. A besieging army often brought its own most deadly enemy, the invisible specter of disease. While knights and siege engines threatened the walls, a far more insidious battle was being waged over the flow of water and the disposal of waste. A city with superior sanitation and public health did not just endure a siege, it actively weaponized the squalor of its opponents. An army camped outside the gates was a chaotic, densely packed settlement with primitive latrines often dug perilously close to its own water supply. In the summer heat, flies would swarm from waste pits to food stores, spreading dysentery and typhus with ruthless efficiency. The dreaded plague could arrive with the fleas on the rats that inevitably infested the besiegers' supply wagons. Inside a well-managed city, however, the reality was starkly different. Aqueducts or protected springs delivered clean drinking water. Strict ordinances governed the removal of garbage and human waste, often transported beyond the walls to fertilize fields. This created a brutal asymmetry. The defenders, though confined, remained relatively healthy and strong. They could man the walls with clear eyes and steady hands. Meanwhile, the attacking force, living in its own filth, would slowly be consumed by fever and dehydration. Their numbers would dwindle not from combat, but from relentless, undignified sickness. Morale would collapse as soldiers watched their comrades die not in glory, but in the mud of the latrine trench. This defense required incredible foresight and communal discipline. turning the mundane tasks of keeping streets clean and water pure into acts of strategic survival. The city that mastered public health ensured that any army foolish enough to surround it was, in fact, trapping itself in a deadly cage of its own making. This quiet victory through hygiene points toward a final, decisive form of protection, one rooted not in biology, but in pure, overwhelming innovation. A city could shatter its besiegers from within its own gates. Technological superiority in siegecraft turned a defensive posture into an overwhelming offensive advantage. Imagine an enemy army, confident in its towering trebuchets and mobile siege towers, only to watch them splinter into dust under a barrage of boulders launched from even larger machines mounted on the city's bastions. This was the power of holding the high ground in engineering. A city that invested in master craftsmen and brilliant engineers did not merely weather an assault, it punished the attackers for even attempting one. The mighty trebuchet, capable of hurling a stone weighing hundreds of pounds over immense distances, was not just a weapon of besiegers. When fixed upon a city's fortified towers, it could outrange and systematically dismantle an enemy's own artillery park, leaving them blind and toothless. Later, the thunderous arrival of early cannon on city walls introduced a psychological terror that could shatter formation discipline before a single shot was fired. But perhaps the most terrifying weapon was a closely guarded secret of the Byzantine Empire, Greek fire. This mysterious, sticky, incendiary liquid could be pumped through siphons or launched in pots, bursting into flames upon contact with water that were nearly impossible to extinguish. A fleet attempting a naval blockade could be transformed into a floating inferno in moments, its sailors faced with a choice between burning alive or drowning. The true defense was not the weapon itself, but the knowledge to create and deploy it. This intellectual property was a state secret more valuable than any vault of gold, protected by sworn oaths and the threat of execution. A city known to possess such advanced technology presented a risk no sane commander would take. The besiegers could not know what new horror the defenders might unleash from their workshops, turning the siege into a terrifying guessing game. This reliance on innovation reveals a profound shift in strategy, where security was found not in passive thickness, but in active, superior intellect. The mastery of physical machines, however, finds its perfect counterpart in the manipulation of something far more elusive: the stories people believe. A whispered word in the right ear could collapse an invasion before a single sword was drawn. The 25th Defense, the control of information and espionage, transformed secrets into a currency more valuable than gold and rumors into weapons sharper than any blade. A city with a well-organized spy network did not wait for an army to appear on the horizon. Its agents, disguised as merchants, pilgrims, or even disaffected nobles within an enemy court, provided the ultimate strategic advantage perfect for knowledge. They could deliver the exact route of march, the strength of the enemy forces, and most critically, the internal rivalries and weaknesses within the opposing command. The Byzantine Empire elevated this to a high art, maintaining a vast and sophisticated intelligence service known as the cubicularios. Their agents operated from the bustling markets of Constantinople to the remote steppes of Central Asia, gathering snippets of conversation that, when pieced together, revealed the grand strategies of rival empires. But this defense was not merely passive listening. It was an active campaign of deception. A well-placed double agent could feed an enemy commander a complete lie, perhaps a fabricated map showing an easy mountain pass that led directly into a box canyon, or a story about a mythical treasure hidden in a vulnerable town, luring his army into a pointless diversion. The goal was always to turn the enemy's mind against itself, to sow such confusion and distrust that the invasion would stall from internal bickering or be abandoned as too risky. A single trusted spy whispering doubts into a general's ear could achieve what 10,000 soldiers might not, saving the city from the horrors of a siege altogether. This intricate shadow war, fought in the dim light of taverns and the hushed corridors of power, demonstrates that the most potent defenses were often those that remained completely invisible to the public eye. Yet the power of perception, so carefully manipulated in secret, also found its most potent expression in a very public and universal language, the language of symbols. A lion rampant on a field of gold could halt an army in its tracks. The visual language of heraldry, displayed on banners, shields, and city gates, was a sophisticated code of intimidation understood by every knight and mercenary. This was far more than decoration. It was a silent declaration of identity and alliance, a psychological gambit designed to win a battle before the first charge. When a city flew the banner of a powerful local lord, it was broadcasting a clear message: attack us, and you answer not to our modest militia, but to the full fury of that lord's entire feudal host. But the most potent symbols were those of the great military orders. The stark black cross of the Teutonic Knights painted on a gatehouse was not just a sign, it was a promise. It signaled that within the walls stood warriors bound by sacred oaths, men who viewed death in battle as a path to salvation. For a typical invading soldier, the prospect of facing such fanatical, professional fighters was a sobering thought. The calculus of risk shifted instantly. Was this city, with its intimidating affiliations, worth the almost certain bloodbath required to take it? This symbolic deterrence was a brilliant form of communication that transcended language barriers. A traveling merchant or a scout would see these symbols and carry the news back to their masters, shaping strategic decisions in distant war councils. The city had weaponized its reputation, crafting an aura of invincibility from cloth and paint. This silent language of power and affiliation finds its ultimate expression not in symbols, but in a far more tangible and universal motivator: the direct promise of wealth. A city could win its safety by freely offering its loyalty. The 27th Defense, the strategy of tribute and vassalage, turned surrender into a shield. This was a cold, pragmatic calculation, where a community would willingly bend the knee to a distant emperor or a powerful neighboring king, not out of weakness, but to secure a far greater power as its protector. In doing so, they exchanged a measure of their hard-won autonomy for the immense security of belonging to a larger, terrifying entity. The Mongol Empire's relentless expansion offers the ultimate example. A town hearing the approach of the Mongol Tumans faced a stark choice: utter annihilation or swift submission. Those who chose to open their gates, acknowledge the Great Khan as their overlord, and agree to pay an annual tribute were not just spared, they were integrated into a vast system of trade and law known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Under this umbrella, their merchants could travel safely from Europe to China. Their artisans found new markets, and their people were protected from the depredations of every other rival lord or bandit army on the continent. This was not cowardice, it was a brilliant survival strategy that recognized a profound truth: that sometimes the fiercest defense is knowing when not to fight. It was the flexibility of the reed in the storm, which bends to avoid breaking, while the rigid oak is torn from its roots. This pragmatic sacrifice of absolute independence for guaranteed security demonstrates that the ultimate ingenuity often lies in a leader's willingness to make a difficult, unpopular choice for the long-term survival of their people. And this very pragmatism, this understanding of human nature and power, finds its echo in the most enduring defense of all, one built not on force or fealty, but on the stories we tell ourselves. A dragon was as real a guardian as any stone giant. The final and perhaps most fascinating of these 28 defenses was woven not from stone or strategy, but from the very fabric of story itself. A city could cloak itself in a shroud of myth and legend, crafting a narrative of supernatural danger that preyed upon the deep-seated superstitions of the age. A cursed treasure hidden within the cathedral, a guardian monster said to dwell in the nearby lake, or the wrath of a forgotten god. These tales, repeated by wide-eyed travelers and embellished by generations of local storytellers, formed a psychological moat that no army could easily cross. To a medieval commander, the decision to attack was not just a military calculation, it was a spiritual one. Would he risk the eternal damnation of his soul, or the unleashing of a plague upon his men, for the sake of a town whispered to be under a witch's protection? The strategic value of such a story was immense. It cost nothing to maintain, required no masons or engineers, and its power only grew with each retelling. A real historical event, like a sudden plague that struck down a previous besieging army, could be transformed over decades into a definitive act of divine punishment. The legend became a self-fulfilling prophecy, discouraging all but the most skeptical or desperate of invaders. In a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was blurred, a good story was not just entertainment, it was the cheapest, most durable, and most universally understood fortification ever conceived. These 28 defenses reveal a profound truth that echoes far beyond the medieval world. True security was never just a matter of height and thickness. It was found in the clever use of landscape, in the bonds of community, in the control of information, and even in the power of a well-told tale. The greatest fortress was not always the one you could see, but the one you believed in. A single strategy was a thread, but woven together, they formed an unbreakable chain. The true power of these 28 defenses was not in any one of them alone, but in their brilliant, terrifying combination. A city protected by a swamp did not rely on the mud alone. It trained its citizens to fight within that swamp, spread myths of monsters dwelling in its foggy depths, and maintained secret alliances that could strangle an invader's supply lines from hundreds of miles away. An attacker faced not a single obstacle to overcome, but an interlocking series of challenges, each one activating as the last was surmounted. An army that miraculously navigated a labyrinthine forest would then face a universally armed militia on its home terrain. If they somehow broke that militia, they would find a deserted town whose poisoned wells and hidden food caches made their victory meaningless. This layered approach created an unsolvable puzzle for any invader, draining their resources, their morale, and their will to continue. This holistic security demanded something far deeper than wealth or military might. It required profound community cohesion. Every citizen, from the farmer hiding grain to the storyteller embellishing a local legend, played a vital role in the collective shield. It demanded generational foresight, the patience to plant orchards that would feed a future siege, or to cultivate a reputation for ferocity over decades. And it required an almost intuitive understanding of both the landscape and the human heart, knowing which mountain passed to collapse and which rumor would paralyze an enemy commander with superstitious dread. The most secure settlements were those that viewed their defense not as a set of walls to be built, but as a living, breathing ecosystem to be nurtured, where every element, from the stories told by the fire to the very water in the ground, contributed to a single, unassailable whole. From the deceptive calm of manipulated rivers to the whispered power of ancient myths, our journey through these 28 strategies reveals a profound truth. The greatest historical defenses were often those that could not be seen, sieged, or battered down. They were not built from stone and mortar, but woven from the very fabric of the land itself, from the collective minds of the people, and from the complex, invisible web of human society. This multifaceted approach to security demonstrates a deep understanding that true strength lies in adaptability and integration, not just in rigid fortification. The medieval mind grasped that a city was more than its buildings. It was a living system, and its protection had to be just as organic and layered. As you look at the world around you now, consider the invisible defenses that protect your own community. What economic networks ensure its stability? What social bonds hold it together in a crisis? What environmental features, whether a local river or a protected forest, contribute to its resilience? The principles of ingenuity and holistic thinking are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. If this exploration into the secrets of the past has captivated you, we invite you to subscribe for more deep dives into historical ingenuity. And we would love to hear your thoughts. Which of these non-walled defenses did you find most fascinating? Share your perspective in the comments below.